You hear it before you see it. A single chirp from a monitoring console in the middle of a quiet weekend. Then another. A thread appears on an underground forum with the kind of headline that makes your stomach drop. Millions of DNA profiles, names, birth years, family ties. It reads like the plot of a sci-fi thriller, except this isn't fiction. It's October 2023, and one of the most intimate data sets on Earth, our ancestry, our family maps, the scaffolding of who we are, is suddenly being hawked in bulk by an adversary who calls himself Golem. The brand is familiar, 23andMe. The promise of easy ancestry insights has collided with the hard reality of account takeover and mass scraping. The room goes cold, the war room lights come up, and the clock starts. From the outside, it looks like a paradox. 23andMe insists its internal systems weren't breached, yet attackers have millions of profiles, and they're bundling some of the data into lists that target specific ethnic groups, including Ashkenazi Jews and people of Chinese descent. In a world where cyber incidents often blur together, this one cuts differently. It's not just another credential dump, it's a map of human connections. Shared DNA percentages, predicted relationships, the breadcrumb trails of our family stories, repackaged as a product. It takes a beat to grasp the scope. Then you realize there's a second threat beyond the theft itself. How this data can be combined, cross-referenced, and operationalized against real people in the real world. Inside incident response channels, a picture starts to form. This was not a smash and grab on a server rack. It was a patient credential stuffing campaign, taking passwords spilled somewhere else on the internet and testing them, over and over, against 23andMe logins until just enough of them worked. With access to a small slice of accounts, later tallied at around 14,000, the intruder pivoted into a social feature called DNA relatives. Through that door, they could see the profiles connected to those compromised accounts and quietly scrape information at industrial scale. One breach vector, network-style exposure. It's the kind of cascading failure that happens when a platform's most beloved feature becomes its soft underbelly. The first executive decision in a crisis is tone. 23andMe's initial public framing, that users' recycled passwords were to blame, lands like a dull thud among customers and privacy advocates. Later, regulators in the UK and Canada will say the company didn't do enough to mitigate foreseeable risks. Lawsuits multiply, password resets roll out. Two-factor authentication, once optional, becomes required for all. But right now, in those first hours and days, the question is simpler. How much got out and who is going to be harmed by it? To understand why this incident matters, you have to understand what 23andMe is built to do. The company created a consumer-friendly pathway into genomics. Mail-in saliva kits, easy reports, instant access to ancestry estimates, and optional health-related insights. But the emotional flywheel of the platform is the social discovery loop. You opt into a feature called DNA relatives, and the system surfaces genetic matches, possible cousins, grandparents, siblings you didn't know you had. To make that work, profiles share certain signals with one another. Display names, relationship labels, how much DNA two people share, bits of family tree metadata. Those signals are what make the product delightful, but they're also what makes a scraping attack catastrophically productive once an intruder gets a toehold. Crucially, DNA relatives is opt-in, which means many users willingly broadcast a curated version of themselves to potential matches. The company did and does allow fine-grained controls, but the defaults and the social incentives push in a familiar direction. Share more to find more. Over years, the feature networked millions of people into a dense web of familial connections. If you stand back and look at it as a graph, each compromised account isn't just a single node. It's a bridge into hundreds or thousands of neighboring profiles, each exposing just enough details, names, ages or birth years, locations, shared DNA percentages, to be valuable to a determined adversary. The power of the feature is precisely what turns it into a force multiplier for attackers. By the time the breach bursts into public view, 23andMe has roughly 14-15 million customers worldwide. When reporters first chased the rumor down in early October 2023, it looks like an opportunistic sale on a forum. Then samples appear that purport to target specific communities. From there, the scope escalates. Within weeks, the company acknowledges that the initially compromised accounts number in the low 5 figures, but that the derivative exposure via DNA relatives expands to millions. It's breach physics. A small access footprint can cascade across a social graph if you can enumerate relationships faster than anyone can detect you. There's another critical bit of context. The data that most reporters and most of us think of when we hear DNA breach is raw genetic files. 23andMe says there's no evidence the attacker exfiltrated genotype files from its back-end systems. That matters technically and legally. But for many victims, the line between raw DNA and ancestry plus family tree signals is not nearly so reassuring. If someone can name your grandparents' birthplaces, identify your maternal or paternal haplogroup, link your surname history, and place you on a family tree with dozens of relatives, then anonymity is no longer your shield. Even without raw DNA, the profile-level insights can be fused with public records to pinpoint people. Privacy harms don't require a fast Q file, they require context. And context is exactly what DNA relatives is designed to illuminate. The last bit of background is cultural. Genetic ancestry is not just trivia, it's identity. Lists that single out ethnic groups carry a special historical menace, and the forums where these data bundles circulate are not neutral marketplaces. When the ads reference specially curated lists of Ashkenazi Jews or people of Chinese descent, it sets off alarms for communities with living memory of persecution. The theft isn't just a violation of privacy, it risks becoming a tool for targeting. That's why this incident quickly moved beyond technical circles and into public policy debates about data retention, default privacy, and the ethics of consumer genomics. The first public tremor arrives on October 1st, 2023, when a threat actor posts a claim that they possess 23andMe user profile data. The forum chatter looks typical at first, big numbers, bold claims. But as journalists request samples, the story hardens. Within a week, mainstream outlets report that data targeting Jewish users has been offered for sale, and the handle Golem begins attaching new bundles to new threads. The records are not raw genome files, they're profile-level exports with names, birth years, relationship labels, and shared DNA percentages. And Me says it's investigating. Throughout October, evidence accumulates that the intruder did not punch through perimeter defenses so much as they walked in through the front door. Reused passwords, tried at scale, on user accounts that lacked mandatory multi-factor authentication. Early lawsuits land by mid-October. Reporters and researchers spot that the leaked samples include data that seems derived from the DNA relatives feature. Meanwhile, 23andMe begins turning certain dials. The company pauses some DNA relatives capabilities, and customers can't download raw data for a period while protective controls are reevaluated. On December 1st, 2023, 23andMe files an amended 8K with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The numbers are striking. Approximately 14,000 user accounts, about 0.1% of the base, were directly accessed via credential stuffing. But because each of those accounts was connected to many others through DNA relatives, the total number of impacted profiles is vastly larger. In disclosures and follow-up reporting, the company clarifies the split. About 5.5 million users who opted into DNA relatives had profile elements accessed. An additional 1.4 million had family tree profile information accessed, bringing the total to around 6.9 million. It's one of those moments where incident math becomes public. December 4th brings the pivot from internal tallies to public accountability. Wired, TechCrunch, and others publish the 6.9 million figure, and 23andMe posts an action plan outlining countermeasures. All customers must reset passwords, and two-step verification becomes mandatory for both new and existing users. It's a belated but material hardening of the authentication surface. In incident response, you rarely get to rewind the tape. You can only draw new lines and say, from here on out, it's different. Within days, a second wave of controversy breaks. In early December, 23andMe updates its terms of service to require arbitration and includes a 30-day window for customers to opt out, an attempt, critics say, to curb class actions in the wake of the breach. Privacy reporters and legal analysts pounce. The company's tone about recycled passwords is read as blame shifting. The comms problem merges with the legal problem. The breach has moved from an operational crisis to a trust crisis. In 2024, the story expands into governance. In June, privacy watchdogs in the UK and Canada announce a joint investigation. By September, 23andMe agrees to a proposed $30 million settlement to resolve U.S. class action claims, including 3 years of security monitoring. The settlement will be challenged and reshaped over time, but the signal is clear. The exposure is being priced, and it isn't cheap. By early 2025, the company's financial picture worsens. 23andMe files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and the breach is cited among the stressors. In June 2025, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, following a joint probe with the Canadian privacy regulator, fines 23andMe $2.31 million for inadequate security measures that failed to prevent the credential stuffing exposure. Then in September 2025, as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, 23andMe seeks approval for an expanded $50 million settlement with a 5-year privacy and medical shield plus genetic monitoring program to resolve claims from the breach. The arc from forum post to regulatory fine to bankruptcy courtroom takes less than 2 years. That's not a timeline, it's a spiral. Let's strip this incident to its operational core. The intrusion vector is credential stuffing. That's not exotic malware or zero-day exploitation. It is the systematic replay of username-password pairs stolen from other breaches, thrown against a login endpoint that lacks universal multi-factor enforcement, and that, at the time, tolerated enough attempts to make the economics work. Attackers love credential stuffing because the internet is awash in reused passwords, and because success rates don't need to be high to be profitable. In this case, the success rate only needed to be large enough to compromise roughly 14,000 accounts, mere 0.1% of the user base. Why did such a small initial compromise trigger such a large downstream exposure? Because of product architecture. DNA relatives is, by design, a discovery engine that connects people. When a valid account participates, it can view profile fields for its genetic matches. If you control that account, you can view those fields too. Scale that across thousands of compromised logins. Add automation to enumerate every available match, and you have an assembly line for scraping. Think of each account as a lens. Attackers collected what the lens could see. Then they repeated the process again and again, harvesting not just direct matches but iterating through the network to build huge lists. The data isn't hidden behind a single API endpoint with a documented limit. It's scattered across profile views, pages, and features that were intended for human eyes and curiosity, now recast as a target for bots. A second ingredient is rate and anomaly detection. No consumer service can completely eliminate credential stuffing, but the defensive goal is to make it expensive. Detect unusual access patterns, throttle login attempts, trigger step-up authentication challenges, and, if a pattern is clear, lock down features that are being abused to extract data. 23andMe ultimately disabled portions of DNA relatives and required password resets. But the attacker's window, according to later accounts and reporting, spanned months. 5 months is a long time in the life of a scraping operation. It implies automation tuned to evade simple thresholds and a platform whose detection signals weren't calibrated for discovery feature abuse at that scale. What exactly was exposed? Here the nuance matters. For about 5.5 million people who opted into DNA relatives, the scraped profiles included fields like display names, predicted relationships, the percentage of DNA shared with genetic matches, and elements of ancestry reporting visible to matches. For another 1.4 million, family tree profile information was accessed. Separately, for the roughly 14,000 accounts directly compromised, additional content might have been visible depending on individual settings, potentially including health-related report details. At no point did the company concede that raw genotype files were stolen from back-end systems, and it emphasized there was no evidence of a cybersecurity incident inside its core infrastructure. That distinction is accurate technically, but the harm calculus doesn't end at the server boundary. It lives where user-exposed fields combine into re-identification risk. Mechanically, the scraping likely exploited how profile pages render and how pagination and filtering work inside DNA relatives. Many consumer apps rely on client-side calls that can be sequenced and replayed. Without tight server-side rate limiting tied to behavioral baselines, an attacker can cycle through lists at machine speed. Consider the graph math. If a single account has hundreds of matches and each match has hundreds more, an automated harvesting run across a few thousand starting points can compile millions of rows quickly. Those rows then get normalized. names, locations, shared DNA values, relationship labels, and packaged for sale. What the market buys is not just data points, but organized intelligence. Curated lists that slice across ethnicity, geography, or even inferred social status. The monetization is in the curation. Authentication posture is the other axis. Before the incident, two-factor authentication existed but was not mandatory for all users. After the breach, 23andMe forced password resets and turned two-step verification into a requirement across the board. It's a stark example of how available isn't the same as on by default. Password reuse is a known societal weakness. The defensive pattern is to assume it and to layer mandatory MFA, breached password checks, and adaptive risk scoring on top. The company's post-incident shift aligns with what security engineers have advocated for years. You don't make MFA optional on a service protecting sensitive, immutable data. You enforce it. Finally, there's the question of detection and disclosure. The public timeline starts in October 2023 with forum posts. Later documentation and reporting indicate the malicious access likely stretched back months, roughly from April through September, before surfacing visibly. That window matters for damage assessments. The longer an attacker can harvest quietly, the larger the eventual data set, the more polished the adversary's product, and the more time they have to segment and market their lists to audiences with motives beyond simple profit. The human impact is immediate and personal. Imagine waking up to find your family tree, names of relatives, their birth years, where they live, circulating in stranger hands, paired with numeric values that quantify your kinship to other people in the dataset. Even if your raw DNA sequence is safe, your anonymity isn't. Lists that single out specific ethnic groups magnify the risk. Communities see echoes of past abuses in present-day spreadsheets. Vulnerable individuals, including those who tested in secret or who have sensitive family histories, face the threat of exposure. Privacy harms in genomics are sticky because DNA is not like a credit card. You cannot reissue a new genome. Numerically, the breach is one of the largest, most nuanced exposures of personal and familial data on record. Around 6.9 million individuals globally see elements of their profiles accessed through DNA relatives or family tree, even though only about 14,000 accounts were directly compromised. Subsequent accounting and legal proceedings will also cite a U.S.-specific figure, about 6.4 million Americans affected, reflecting jurisdictional claims. These aren't just numbers to pad a headline. They're the measure of a social graph turned inside out. Operationally, the company scrambles to contain damage, resetting passwords and mandating multi-factor authentication. On the product side, it temporarily disables some DNA relatives' capabilities and, for a time, the ability to download raw data, signals that internal teams are hardening endpoints and reevaluating access pathways. These steps are textbook containment, but for many observers they come too late. The horse is out of the barn. The question now is how to care for the people trampled in the stampede. Legally, the fallout is complex. Customers file suits alleging negligence, privacy invasions, and inadequate safeguards. 23andMe responds with a terms of service update that funnels disputes into arbitration, drawing sharp criticism from privacy advocates and tech policy journalists who view the move as a way to dampen accountability. Over 2024, a proposed $30 million class settlement emerges, including 3 years of security monitoring for affected users. Critics argue it undervalues genetic privacy. Defenders point to the company's financial stress and insurance coverage. It becomes a case study in how modern privacy harms get monetized, negotiated, and ultimately memorialized in case law. Regulators step in. In June 2024, the UK Information Commissioner's Office and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada announce a joint investigation. A year later, the ICO imposes a $2.31 million fine, citing inadequate security measures in the face of large-scale credential stuffing and the sensitivity of the data involved. The fine is a signal to the entire direct-to-consumer genomics sector. You will be held to a higher standard when you collect information that cannot be changed or revoked. The joint nature of the probe underscores a second message. Privacy enforcement is increasingly transnational. Then comes the business reckoning. In 2025, 23andMe files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, removing its longtime CEO and seeking a buyer as legal and operational costs mount. In September 2025, amid the bankruptcy, the company asks a federal judge to approve an expanded $50 million settlement package with a 5-year privacy and medical shield plus genetic monitoring program. Effectively, an acknowledgement that support for the people harmed by the breach must be long-term. For customers, the bankruptcy raises fresh anxieties about the potential fate of stored genetic data in any asset sale. Even with assurances, trust bleeds slowly back into a brand once associated with discovery and delight. There's a subtler impact too, a chilling effect. Consumers who were already uneasy about sending their DNA to a private company now have a cautionary tale to point to. Competing services quietly review their own defaults, with several switching on two-factor authentication by default in the breach's wake. The industry's social sharing features, chromosome browsers, relative match browsers, genealogical overlays, come under scrutiny as product teams confront an uncomfortable truth. The very elements that make users feel connected also make adversaries efficient. The 23andMe breach is a fork in the road for consumer genomics. On one path, platforms accept that authentication cannot be left to user diligence. Mandatory multi-factor authentication is table stakes. Breached password checks at sign-up and login become continuous, not periodic. Risk-based challenges, step-up verification triggered by anomalies like impossible travel or unusual scraping patterns, become default, not deluxe. If your business model relies on data that can never be rotated, your security controls can't be nice to have. They must be non-negotiable. The industry already took tentative steps in this direction in late 2023. The expectation now is permanence and rigor. On the other path lies product re-architecture. Discovery features that expose relationship graphs need guardrails that assume adversarial automation. That means rate limits keyed to behavior, not just IP addresses. Server-side pagination that prioritizes human-scale use. Anomaly detection tuned to the cadence of scraping. And circuit breakers that automatically disable features when harvesting patterns spike above normal. It may also mean designing privacy-preserving representations of relatedness, exposing coarser-grained signals to casual matches while requiring verified, consent-rich steps to reveal sensitive specifics. The goal is to preserve the magic while removing the mass export vector. Platforms will need to stress test those features against red teamers who think like Golem, not like product managers. Regulation is catching up. The joint UK-Canada investigation and subsequent ICO fine establish a playbook for cross-border enforcement when harms spill across jurisdictions. Expect more cooperation, more harmonized requirements for default security, and sharper expectations for breach detection and disclosure timelines. The more sensitive the data class, the higher the bar. Genetic data sits at the apex because it binds families together, reveals medical predispositions, and carries cultural meaning. If biometrics require strong default protections, genomics demands stronger still. The legal landscape will remain fluid. Class actions and mass arbitration are shaping how privacy violations are compensated in the United States. The proposed and revised settlements around 23andMe, particularly as the company navigates bankruptcy, show how courts may weigh financial viability against victim support. The introduction of multi-year genetic monitoring programs in settlement terms points to a future where redress for data harms isn't a one-time check, but an ongoing service. That model could migrate into regulation, with statutes requiring long-tail support when immutable data is exposed. For individuals, the practical outlook is a mix of agency and constraint. You can delete your data and destroy a stored sample. You can lock down sharing features and rotate credentials. You can insist on unique passwords and use an authenticator app instead of SMS. But the relational nature of genetic data means your privacy is partially entangled with others. If a cousin opted into a discovery feature years ago with a weak password, you may feel the ripple too. That is the hard lesson of the breach-era internet. Personal data is communal in effect. Services that traffic in kinship have to build for that reality from the onset, or they will be rebuilt by it after the fact. The final shift may be cultural. The early consumer genomics boom framed DNA as entertainment, surprises wrapped in glossy dashboards. The next phase will treat DNA as critical infrastructure for identity, health, and family. Fun can still be part of the pitch, but Fortress has to be part of the delivery. Companies will compete not only on ancestry accuracy or interface polish, but on provable security controls and third-party audits that test the abuse cases the 23andMe attacker exploited. As breaches grow more targeted and curation-driven, the only defensible posture is one that anticipates the market for harm and designs it into obsolescence. We're in the war room again, but the noise has faded. What lingers is the shape of the breach and the shape of the response, and what they tell us about the world we're building. A small number of compromised accounts, about 14,000, served as stepping stones to a larger networked exposure of roughly 6.9 million people. The vector wasn't exotic, yet the fallout was profound because the product's social graph turned a pinpoint intrusion into a panoramic scrape. That is the enduring lesson. Complexity and connectivity are force multipliers for good and for harm. When a feature helps us find relatives, it also helps adversaries find us. When a platform optimizes for discovery, it must also design for denial. Denial of mass export, denial of silent enumeration, denial of automation at scale. If you are a builder inside a company that stewards immutable data, this incident hands you a checklist framed not as bullets but as absolutes. Make multi-factor authentication mandatory by default, not optional by persuasion. Run breached password screening continuously, not just at sign-up. Treat any social discovery surface as a potential exfiltration bus and wire it with tripwires that trigger step-up challenges and circuit breakers when behavior spikes. Tune anomaly detection to scrape signatures, not just login failures. Test your defenses against red teams who think like sellers on breach forums. And when you do get hit, and everyone does, speak like a steward, not a defense attorney. The difference between owning a failure and offloading it onto users is the difference between rebuilding trust and spending it to zero. If you are a user, you have moves to make, even within the constraints of entangled data. Rotate your password to something unique and long and never reuse it. Turn on an authenticator app-based second factor and treat SMS as a fallback. Pare down what your profile displays to matches. Question whether you need to participate in discovery features at all, and if you do, understand the radius of exposure. If the service offers deletion of data and destruction of stored samples, learn how it works and what traces remain. Ask yourself what you would be comfortable with a stranger knowing, because that, not the marketing copy, is the functional privacy boundary. None of these steps are glamorous, but in a world where your cousin's password can become your problem, they are the difference between vulnerability and resilience. And if you are a policymaker or regulator, the 23andMe breach is a brief for urgency and nuance. Urgency, because credential stuffing is an old problem, and the public has a right to assume default protections on services that hold their most intimate data. Nuance, because harm here is not limited to the account holder. It radiates through family trees and cultural communities. The joint UK-Canada investigation and the ICO's find sketch the contours of a new baseline. The settlements that fund multi-year monitoring hint at the long arc of redress that immutable data demands. Keep going. Demand that sensitive by design sectors demonstrate control over scraping, not just over perimeter defense. Measure disclosure in days, not months. Incentivize deletion pathways that are clear and enforceable. The goal is not to end discovery. It's to ensure discovery cannot be weaponized at scale. The story of the 23andMe breach is not the story of a mastermind with a novel exploit. It's the story of an industry that made powerful tools for connecting people, and then learned painfully how those same tools can be abused. It's the story of defaults that were too soft, of features that were too trusting, and of a threat actor who understood that 100 doors can open 1,000 more. But it's also a map for what comes next. Platforms that start secure and stay secure. Products that anticipate scraping from day one, and a culture that treats genetic data like what it is, profoundly sensitive, enduringly valuable, and worth protecting with the best we have. If we take that map seriously, the next time the console chirps, it won't be an emergency. It will be a test we're ready to pass.